Hi, and welcome to the last live coding video for Asynchronous 3. For this example, or for this set of examples, please go ahead if you haven't already and download the rosters.py Python file from the course homepage. You'll see that right underneath this module. You'll need this code to work through the examples that we're going to do now. So if you haven't already, just go ahead and pause the video to download the Python file. When you open it up, it should look like this. Okay, so what I've done here is I have defined two variables, which are both lists. One represents my computer science roster, CS roster, and one represents my calculus roster. So you can see that these are both lists, and the items are strings, SG, JG, ML, etc. And what I'm doing is I'm actually representing each student on those rosters by their first initial and their last initial. So that's the choice that I've made for this program. So the first thing that I want to show you is that CS roster and calc roster are what are called global variables in this program. What that means is that they haven't been defined within a function, and so they can be accessed by any function that we might go on to define in this program. So for that reason, they're called global. They can be accessed by everybody. That is to be contrasted with local variables, which are defined within a function. So the first thing that we want to do is, before I do that, I want to just run this. And I want to show you one cool thing with lists that you can do is you can check for inclusion in a list as follows. So if I wanted to check whether Kakinda Norris, so KN, is in my CS class, so KN in CS roster, that's going to give me true or false depending on whether she is in that roster. So if I check whether AJ is in CS roster, I see false. So apparently KN is in the list and AJ is not. So this in keyword in Python is really useful to check for inclusion in a list. So we will use that with this first challenge, which is we are going to define a function called inClass that takes a parameter called student that returns true if the student is in the CS roster and false otherwise. So this is a function that will have a Boolean return, true or false. Okay. Go ahead, you can pause the video now, and you're actually going to try to define this function on your own. And if you feel like you're able to do that after you define it, go ahead and test it by calling the function and see if it gives you the expected returns. Great, so hopefully you've had a chance to try this out. I'll show you how I thought about this. So I'm defining inClass with a parameter called student. And basically I'm just going to check whether student is in the CS roster by doing my in, so if student in CS roster, I will return true. Else, meaning the student was not in the CS roster, I'll just return false. Let's run that. Great, and I'll just test it here from the shell. So inClass KN, so I'll call the function and pass KN as the parameter. I get true because KN is in the class, so that makes sense. And if I check another one that I know is not in the list, I get false. So it seems like my function is working. Great. So a key takeaway here is that because CS roster and calc roster are global variables, we are able to access them from within this function. Okay, so we're going to write another function now where we're going to define a function called IDnum, whoops, I should say ID, that takes in a student parameter that generates a random ID number, and let's say that's between 1 and 1,000, for a student if they are on the CS roster, and if they're not on a CS roster, an error message should get returned instead. So I'm going to think this one aloud because it combines a few different ideas. So defining ID num student. And you know what? I'm going to delete this code just so that you can see the function I'm writing now more clearly, but you can feel free to leave that code on your screen. Okay. So if the student is in the CS roster, so if student in CS roster, I want to return a random ID number for that student. So I'm going to return a random number by doing random.randrange. And since the numbers go from 1 to 1,000, I'm going to put 1, 1,001. Your students will do this, they'll run this, it won't work, and that's because you haven't imported random. So up here, just go back and import random, no big deal. Okay, else. Well, in this case, the else means that the student was not in the CS roster. So in that case, they want me to print out, or excuse me, return an error message. So you can literally return a string that says anything you want. Error, student not in CS class. Okay? And then just to test this out, let's actually write some function calls right here in the code editor. So I'll try to generate an ID num for 2 students who I know are in the CS class. So JT and OI. And then I'll also try to generate an ID num for AJ, who we know is not in the CS class. And because we remember that we actually have to print out those return values in order to see anything, we will do that. Okay. So it seems like we should get ID numbers for the first 2, and we should get the error message for the last one. So let's see what happens. We get 2 random ID numbers and then an error message. Great. So why don't you go ahead and catch up, type out this function, and then call the function. And you can go ahead and try calling it multiple times with different students just to make sure that it works. Great. So we're gonna end this video with one more challenge that you're gonna try, which is to define a function called last name with a parameter called letter that returns a list of all, let's say, CS students whose last name begins with the given letter. And then just note, ML means that the student's last name begins with L. Okay? So I'll get you started. We want to define last name, and the parameter will be a letter. And you want to see if you can somehow build up a list of all of the students in the CS roster whose last name begins with that letter. Okay? When you think you've got it, go ahead and test it out, see if it works. And then when you're ready, you can restart the video and I will show you how I did it. Okay, so I know that I am going to be returning a list, and so we've used this trick a couple of times. It's a good trick. I'm just going to define a list. I'll just call it new list, and it's going to be empty for the time being. What I'm going to do is I'm going to loop over the CS roster and add a student to the list if their last name begins with letter. Okay, so I start with an empty list and then I just add onto it as I go along. And then when I'm done, I can just return new list. So I'm gonna loop over CS roster. So I think I'll set this up as for student in CS roster. So here student will represent each actual item in CS roster. And then I'll say if student sub 1. So what does that mean? Well, each student has it's a string with 2 letters, indexed 0 and 1. So that index 1 letter represents their last name. So that's what I want to pick off here. And I want to say if student sub 1 is equals that letter, I am going to add that student into my list. So new list dot append student. Now, one thing your students will always want to do is whenever they have an if statement like this, they'll just be inclined to write an else statement. Well, in this case, they're going to get stuck because they're not going to know what to put in the else statement. If the student's last name begins with letter, then we want to add them to our list. But if it doesn't begin with letter, we don't want to do anything. So for that reason, we don't even need an else statement. All we need is an if. Now, after we've looped through everybody and added the appropriate students to the list, we then want to return the final list. So the way we'll do that is return new list. Just fix that formatting. Great. So let's go ahead and define the function. And here I will call the function last name. And why don't we test it out with the letter G? And there I get my 3 students whose last name begins with G. So that is pretty cool. Now, what if I pick a letter where none of my students have that last name? So I don't think any of my students' last names start with X. And in that case, you can see an empty list gets returned because nothing got added to the list in that case. Okay, so you can go ahead and fix up your code, test it out, make sure you understand it, and feel free to rewind the video and listen to this example as many times as you need.